By 1917, 23 of RCA's 25 American factories sat inside a single square mile of Camden, New Jersey, a city smaller in land area than some airports, that also built more warships than almost any yard in the world and canned more soup than any factory on Earth. Today, that same 9 square miles is regularly ranked among the poorest cities in the United States, its median household income among the lowest of any city its size in the entire country. And for a stretch of years in the early 2000s, it carried a title darker than poor, the most dangerous city in America, with a murder rate that FBI statistics once measured at more than 18 times the national average. This is the story of how a strip of riverbank across from Philadelphia, with almost nothing going for it except its location on a deep water river, became one of the most productive square miles on the planet, and how, within 2 generations, it became the exact opposite kind of national byword before beginning, in fits and starts, to try to become something else again. Camden's advantage, from the very beginning, was simply proximity. Before European settlement, the land had been home to the Lenni Lenape, who fished, farmed, and hunted along the Delaware until Dutch and Swedish traders, and later a much more concentrated wave of English colonization following the restoration of King Charles II, gradually displaced them through the second half of the 1600s. The land across the river from Philadelphia had been settled by Quaker families since the late 1600s, clustered around a handful of ferry crossings, the most enduring one run by the Cooper family since 1695 at a spot known as Cooper's Ferry. Jacob Cooper, a descendant of that same family, played a central role in developing the settlement that would eventually take the name Camden in 1773, naming it after Charles Pratt, the Earl of Camden, an English lord sympathetic to the American colonial cause. For more than a century, this stretch of West Jersey existed mostly as an appendage to the booming city of brotherly love across the water, 3 loosely connected villages of taverns, ferry landings, and farmhouses, rather than a city in any real sense, a place travelers passed through rather than a destination in its own right. Camden incorporated as its own municipality in 1828, and even then it grew slowly, reaching a population of only around 3,500 by 1840, enough to justify carving Camden County out of neighboring Gloucester County in 1844, but still nowhere close to a major American city. The turning point arrived in 1834, when the Camden and Amboy Railroad opened, giving the sleepy riverfront town a direct rail link toward New York, and manufacturers began to notice what Camden actually offered. Cheap land, a navigable river deep enough for ocean-going ships, and a short ferry ride to one of the largest cities in the country. By 1870, the city counted 125 recorded manufacturers, nearly double what it had a decade earlier, producing everything from wagons and iron goods to tanned leather and glassware. The companies that would define Camden for the next century arrived in a remarkably tight window. A steel pen manufacturer, the Estabrook Pen Company, the first of its kind in the country, set up in Camden in 1860. Joseph Campbell, a fruit merchant, partnered with icebox manufacturer Abraham Anderson to open a small canning operation on the Camden waterfront in 1869. Initially just one canning operation among many, packing tomatoes, vegetables, and preserves under a name that meant nothing to anyone yet. And the company did not perfect the condensed soup recipe that would make it a household name until chemist John T. Dorrance patented the process in 1897. In 1894, Eldridge Johnson, a machinist who ran a small manufacturing shop in Camden and had been tinkering with ways to improve the crude, hand-cranked phonographs of the era, partnered with inventor Emil Berliner to found what would become the Victor Talking Machine Company. And by the early 1900s, Victor's Camden studios were recording some of the biggest names in music: Enrico Caruso, Arturo Toscanini, John Philip Sousa, using recording technology that was, for its era, cutting edge and building a global distribution network that made the company's Nipper trademark, a dog listening to his master's voice on a gramophone horn, one of the most recognized commercial images on Earth. And in 1899, the New York Shipbuilding Corporation broke ground on a sprawling yard along the Delaware, drawn by the same deep water access that had once made Camden a convenient ferry stop and now made it an ideal place to launch battleships. By the turn of the 20th century, Camden's population had rocketed from just 14,358 in 1860 to nearly 76,000 in 1900, an industrial boom built on 3 companies that, between them, would eventually be known simply as Camden's Big Three. Immigration reshaped the city just as fast as industry did. Through the late 1800s, Camden's newcomers had been mostly British, German, and Irish, but by 1920, the balance had shifted decisively toward Italians, Poles, Russians, and other Southern and Eastern Europeans, many Catholic, many Jewish, arriving to fill positions in the shipyard and the electronics plants. These communities clustered into distinct neighborhoods, much the way they did in other industrial cities of the era. Italian families settling around parishes in South Camden near the shipyard gates, Polish, and other Eastern European families filling in blocks closer to the RCA complex. Each neighborhood built around its own churches, social clubs, and corner groceries that catered to the specific tastes and languages of the families who lived there. Black residents, present in smaller numbers in Camden since the 1830s, arrived in larger waves alongside the broader Great Migration, drawn by the same industrial wages, pulling immigrants from across the Atlantic, settling largely in neighborhoods on the city's north and east sides that would, within a few decades, become the heart of Camden's black community. In 1926, the city's connection to Philadelphia was transformed permanently when the Delaware River Bridge, later renamed the Benjamin Franklin Bridge, opened at a final cost of just over $37 million, split evenly between New Jersey and Pennsylvania, finally rendering obsolete the ferry system that had defined Camden's relationship to its larger neighbor for 2 centuries. Victor Talking Machine merged into the Radio Corporation of America in 1929, becoming RCA Victor, and by the height of its Camden operations, the company employed 12,000 workers producing phonographs, records, and eventually radios and televisions inside a sprawling complex crowned by a giant stained glass window depicting Nipper, the company's famous listening dog, a piece of branding so recognizable it is still preserved today at the Camden County Historical Society. Long before any of the big three arrived, Camden had already produced one claim to lasting fame that had nothing to do with industry at all. The poet Walt Whitman moved to Camden in 1873 to be near his dying mother and brother and ended up spending nearly the last 2 decades of his life in the city, first in a modest rented house on Mickle Street, and later in a home he purchased himself, the only house he ever owned. Whitman died in Camden in 1892, and by his own account had come to identify with the gritty, industrious, unglamorous character of the place, once reportedly remarking that he wanted to be buried within sight of the city that had taken him in. His Mickle Street house still stands today as a small museum, a quiet literary footnote tucked inside a city that, within a few decades of his death, would become world famous for entirely different reasons: warships, phonograph records, and canned soup. The Great Depression tested Camden's industrial foundation without breaking it. By the mid-1930s, the city was so strapped for cash that it resorted to paying municipal workers in scrip rather than currency, a humiliating workaround that nonetheless kept basic services running, city employees accepting paper promises redeemable at local merchants in place of an actual paycheck, while officials scrambled to keep the books balanced. What kept Camden itself from collapsing was the sheer weight of its big three, which together employed close to 25,000 people straight through the worst years of the Depression, a level of industrial resilience most American cities of Camden's size could not match. Campbell's in particular used the lean years to solidify its national reputation, its affordable canned soups, finding a receptive audience among families stretching every dollar, while RCA Victor leaned on radio manufacturing just as broadcast radio was becoming the dominant form of American home entertainment, a lucky convergence of timing that kept Camden's factories humming even as unemployment lines lengthened in cities built around less essential products. New companies kept arriving even in the leanest years. On June 6, 1933, Camden hosted the opening of America's first drive-in movie theater, a small but telling sign of a city still inventing new things even in hard times. During the First World War, the federal government had built an entire planned garden village called Yorkshire Village, later renamed Fairview, to house shipyard workers, a European-style development of curving streets, brick row houses, and a central town square modeled deliberately on English Garden City planning principles, a layout that stood in deliberate contrast to Camden's older industrial grid, and was intended to prove that even mass-produced wartime worker housing could be genuinely livable rather than merely functional. The village survives largely intact today, one of the best preserved examples of federally funded Garden City planning anywhere in the country, a quiet architectural footnote to the urgency of the shipbuilding effort that justified building it in the first place. The Camden Forge Company, a separate but closely linked operation, supplied the forged steel components that kept New York shipbuilding running through both World Wars, one more link in an industrial chain that made Camden, disproportionate to its size, one of the most important production centers on the entire East Coast. World War II pushed Camden's industrial output to its absolute limit. New York shipbuilding's workforce swelled to 47,000 people at its wartime peak, working around the clock in shifts that never fully stopped, constructing everything from cruisers to the aircraft carrier USS Kitty Hawk and the ill-fated heavy cruiser USS Indianapolis, at a yard that briefly ranked as the largest and most productive shipbuilding operation on the planet, RCA. Victor's factories ran around the clock producing radio and radar equipment for the war effort, drawing on exactly the recording and broadcast expertise the company had spent decades perfecting for entirely peaceful purposes. Campbell's canneries kept feeding both the home front and troops overseas, shipping millions of cans a year to a military that needed food that could survive a transatlantic crossing without spoiling. The yard's engineering reputation outlasted the war itself. In 1962, New York Shipbuilding launched the NS Savannah, the world's first commercial nuclear-powered cargo ship, a genuinely futuristic vessel, a floating advertisement for the peaceful uses of atomic power, built at a yard whose best days, though nobody fully realized it yet, were already beginning to slip behind it. By 1950, Camden's population reached its all-time peak of 124,555 residents, and manufacturing employment in the city hit 43,267 jobs that same year, the high watermark of an industrial base that, for half a century, had made this cramped 9-square-mile city one of the most productive patches of ground in the entire United States. In 1950, Rutgers University formally absorbed the College of South Jersey to create Rutgers University Camden, adding an institution of higher learning to a skyline already dominated by factory smokestacks and shipyard cranes, a city that, on paper, appeared to be settling in for permanent, diversified success. Picture the Camden waterfront on a shift change afternoon sometime around 1950, the exact year of the city's peak. Workers stream out through the gates of New York shipbuilding in their thousands, hard hats still on, lunch pails swinging, heading for row houses in tightly knit ethnic neighborhoods organized as much as anything around which Catholic parish or which Camden factory a family's men worked at. Polish and Italian social clubs sit a few doors down from corner taverns that fill up within minutes of every shift change. A few blocks inland, the sweet, heavy smell of tomatoes and simmering broth drifts from the Campbell's cannery, thick enough some days to hang over entire streets, a smell longtime residents would later describe almost fondly, the way people speak about a factory whistle they grew up setting their whole day around. Somewhere in the RCA complex, engineers who had spent the war years perfecting radar are now racing to get television sets into production for a consumer market that barely existed 5 years earlier, while down on Mickle Street, a small brick row house sits quietly as a minor literary curiosity, the place where a famous old poet once lived and died, mostly unnoticed by a city too busy building the future to dwell much on its past. Across the river, the lights of Philadelphia glow, and the still new Benjamin Franklin Bridge carries streams of cars and buses back and forth over the Delaware, no ferry required. It is, by any measure available in 1950, a textbook American industrial success story, dense, ethnically layered, and utterly dependent on 3 companies that, at that exact moment, showed no obvious sign of ever leaving. They left anyway, and it happened faster than almost anyone expected. The very unionization that had helped Camden's factory workers win decent wages through the 1930s and 1940s became, in the eyes of RCA and Campbell's corporate leadership, the reason to leave. Beginning in the 1950s, both companies pursued what amounted to capital flight, decentralizing their production to newer, non-union facilities in other states and eventually other countries, specifically to escape the rising labor costs that Camden's organized workforce had fought hard to secure. RCA began shifting production to rural Indiana as early as the 1940s, chasing lower-wage, non-union labor, and by 1968 had begun employing workers across the border in Chihuahua, Mexico. Instead, a slow bleed of jobs out of Camden that most residents would not fully register until the plant floors that once ran 3 shifts a day sat largely empty. Campbell's, after a bruising 1934 strike that first exposed the depth of labor tension inside the company, gradually moved the bulk of its cannery production out of Camden altogether, and by 1979 had replaced locally grown South Jersey tomatoes with industrially processed tomato paste shipped in from California, severing the last direct link between the company's signature product and the region that had once supplied it, even as the company's corporate headquarters, notably, stayed put in Camden, a distinction that would matter later. New York shipbuilding, meanwhile, never fully recovered its wartime scale once military contracts dried up, and after years of mismanagement, labor unrest, and construction accidents that further damaged its reputation with the Navy, the yard that had once employed 47,000 people shut down entirely in 1967. Manufacturing jobs across Camden, which had peaked at 43,267 in 1950, would fall to just 10,200 by 1982, a decline of nearly 75% in barely a generation. The human geography of the city was being rearranged just as violently as its economy. Through the 1960s, the same white ethnic families who had once filled Camden's parish-centered neighborhoods began leaving for surrounding suburbs like Cherry Hill in a wave of white flight, chasing safety, better schools, and the same kind of home ownership opportunity the GI Bill was making possible across the entire country. At the same time, a growing wave of Puerto Rican migrants arrived in Camden throughout the 1950s and 1960s, drawn by factory jobs. Even as those jobs were beginning to disappear, settling into neighborhoods the departing white families had just vacated, and building a community that would, within a decade, become one of the largest concentrations of Puerto Rican residents in the entire state of New Jersey. The construction of the North-South Freeway through Camden in the 1960s displaced 1,289 families, 85% of them non-white, demolishing entire blocks in the name of highway progress and replacing barely 100 new low-income housing units for every 3,000 destroyed. Unemployment climbed as the factory jobs disappeared, and in 1971, civil unrest that had been building for years finally erupted into open rioting after Horacio Jimenez, a Puerto Rican motorist, was killed by 2 Camden police officers. A single incident that detonated years of accumulated frustration among the city's newest residents over policing, poverty, and a city that increasingly felt like it was being left behind by its own former prosperity. The riots of 1971 did not resolve so much as recede, leaving behind a city whose downtown business district, once thick with department stores and movie theaters serving a population of well over 100,000, began emptying out through the rest of the decade as remaining retailers followed their customers to suburban shopping centers built along the new highways. By the late 1970s, block after block of Camden's downtown commercial corridor sat boarded up or demolished outright, land banked by a city government that had neither the money nor, increasingly, the political will to redevelop it. The same freeway construction that had displaced thousands of families in the 1960s had also succeeded in making it easier than ever for anyone with a car, and a reason to leave Camden to simply drive past it entirely on the way to somewhere else, reducing the city, for many commuters and shoppers from the surrounding suburbs, to little more than an exit sign on the way to the bridge. The numbers from here tell a story of near total collapse. From that 1950 peak of 124,555 residents, Camden's population had fallen to 84,910 by 1980 and kept falling from there. Campbell's finally announced the closure of its remaining Camden soup production in 1989, eliminating 2,800 jobs and ending soup manufacturing in the city entirely by 1990, and the old cannery buildings were imploded in 1991 to clear space for redevelopment that would take years to materialize. By the early 1990s, more than half of Camden's population was African American, and roughly a third was Hispanic. Nearly half the city was under the age of 21, and unemployment ran more than twice the statewide average, with close to half of all residents living below the poverty line. Crime, unsurprisingly, filled the vacuum left by industry. By 2008, Camden recorded 2,933 violent crimes for every 100,000 residents, against a national rate of 455. And CQ Press, which ranked American cities annually by crime statistics, named Camden the single most dangerous city in the entire United States in 2004, 2005, and again in 2009. Whitman Park, a residential neighborhood not far from where the poet had once lived out his final years, became a byword for the crisis in its own right. Its streets lined with what county officials would later describe as open-air drug markets operating in plain sight, more than 170 of them scattered across the city's 9 square miles by 2013, while a Baptist church on Mount Ephraim Avenue kept its bullet-scarred stained glass windows as an unintended monument to how routine the gunfire had become. In 2012, the city recorded 67 homicides and 172 shooting victims in a population of barely 77,000, a murder rate that briefly exceeded those of entire countries, considered among the most dangerous and violent on earth. Camden's political leadership compounded the damage rather than solving it. 3 different Camden mayors, Angelo Ericetti, Arnold Webster, and Milton Milan, were eventually convicted and jailed for corruption, a pattern of civic dysfunction layered directly on top of the economic collapse, leaving residents to conclude, not unreasonably, that neither the factories nor the city hall built to serve them could be relied upon. Camden's civic institutions frayed right alongside its crime statistics. The city had once supported 2 Carnegie-funded public libraries, part of the same philanthropic wave that built libraries in industrial towns across the country in the early 1900s, but decades of budget crises left the system so financially beleaguered that it faced total closure by the end of 2010. The main library branch closed its doors in February 2011, absorbed into the county system, and eventually reopened only as a single floor inside a Rutgers University building, a small but telling symbol of a municipal government that could no longer sustain even its most basic institutions on its own. The old RCA complex itself became a small case study in Camden's repeated, only partially successful attempts at reinvention long before the 2013 tax incentive program arrived. General Electric, which had reacquired RCA in 1986, considered simply abandoning its remaining Camden buildings until the state of New Jersey, under Governor Jim Florio, brokered an unusual deal in 1992, agreeing to construct a new high-tech facility on the site of the old, by then demolished, Campbell's cannery and trade it to GE. In exchange for the aging RCA Victor buildings, the company no longer wanted. Those new buildings were sold onto the defense contractor Martin Marietta, which merged with Lockheed in 1994 to form Lockheed Martin, which in turn divested the site in 1997 as part of the creation of L3 Communications, a chain of corporate ownership spanning 4 different companies in barely a decade, each one a little further removed from the original manufacturing operation that had made the site famous in the first place. The building would not find a lasting new purpose until the tax incentive era of the 2010s finally brought Camden's health system in a wave of subsidized corporate tenants to finish what GE's awkward 1992 trade had only begun. Then, remarkably, something actually worked. Investigations into the Camden Police Department through the early 2010s uncovered systemic corruption so severe that courts ultimately overturned the convictions of 88 people after officers were found to have planted evidence, fabricated reports, and committed perjury on a routine basis. Corruption a CNN investigation later described as having rendered the entire agency unfixable. Rather than attempt incremental reform, city and county officials, backed by Governor Chris Christie and guided by the retained law enforcement consultant John Timoney, made an unprecedented decision. In 2013, the entire Camden Police Department was formally dissolved, every single officer laid off, and replaced from scratch by a new, non-unionized Camden County Police Department built around a philosophy its chief, Scott Thompson, who had also run the old department, described simply as wanting officers to see themselves as guardians rather than warriors. Only about 100 of the old department's roughly 260 officers were eventually rehired under the new structure, which brought on hundreds of new recruits at lower pay in order to field nearly 3 times as many officers on the street. The early results were rocky, drawing criticism for a spike in minor summonses, tickets for offenses as small as riding a bicycle without a bell, and a police force that, in the eyes of some longtime residents, felt less connected to the community than the deeply flawed department it replaced, and which some noted had become considerably whiter than the city it patrolled. But the crime numbers were undeniable. Homicides fell from 67 in 2012 to just 25 by 2019, a drop of nearly 63%, and violent crime overall declined by more than 40% over the same 7 years, a turnaround dramatic enough that Camden became a national case study, praised even by former President Barack Obama, and cited by policymakers as far away as Minneapolis during the police reform debates that followed George Floyd's murder in 2020. The same years that rebuilt Camden's police department also brought a wave of new corporate investment, engineered through one of the most generous and most controversial tax incentive programs in American history. Starting in 2013, the New Jersey Economic Development Authority began offering enormous tax breaks to companies willing to relocate jobs into Camden, and over the following years, more than one. $6 billion in incentives flowed into the city, drawing Subaru of America's national headquarters, the nuclear equipment manufacturer Holtec International, American Water, the Philadelphia 76ers training complex, and Camden's own Cooper University Health System, among others. The program transformed the skyline of Camden's waterfront, filling in parking lots and vacant land with genuine corporate office towers for the first time in decades. And local officials pointed to more than $1 billion in new private investment as proof the strategy was working. It also became the subject of a bitter, years-long political scandal after journalists at ProPublica and WNYC revealed that roughly $1 billion of those tax breaks had gone to companies with direct ties to George Norcross, the single most powerful unelected Democratic power broker in South Jersey politics, and his brother Philip, a lawyer whose firm helped write the incentive legislation itself, and which boasted openly on its own website of being the premier counsel in the state for winning such credits. Norcross, along with 5 associates, including former Camden Mayor Dana Redd, was indicted on sweeping state racketeering charges in June 2024, accused of using threats and political pressure, including a recorded warning to one Philadelphia developer that he would, in Norcross's own words, never do business in this town again, to seize control of lucrative waterfront redevelopment projects. A trial court dismissed the entire indictment in February 2025, ruling that prosecutors had failed to allege an actual crime, a dismissal a state appellate panel upheld in January 2026. And by that February, New Jersey's Attorney General's office formally abandoned the case altogether, choosing not to appeal further to the state Supreme Court. Norcross has denied all wrongdoing throughout and has signaled plans to pursue his own lawsuit against the state for malicious prosecution. Whatever the legal outcome, questions about who actually benefited from the incentive program have proven harder to dismiss, and Camden residents themselves have been some of the loudest voices raising them. Community organizers gathered signatures for a grassroots petition that eventually forced the city to begin publishing more local hiring numbers for incentive recipients online, a small transparency win that nonetheless confirmed what many residents had long suspected. Subsequent disclosures showed that Subaru, which received a $118 million tax break in 2014, employed just 10 Camden residents out of nearly 800 workers at its new headquarters. George Norcross's own insurance brokerage, which received an $86 million break to build an office tower on the waterfront, employed 6 Camden locals out of more than 400 total employees. Not every recipient told the same story. Holtec International, which took the second largest tax break in New Jersey history at $260 million, employed 37 Camden residents among its workforce, and the scrap and recycling firm Eastern Metal Recycling employed 186 Camden residents out of roughly 650 total. Evidence that the hiring outcomes varied enormously depending on the kind of business involved rather than the size of the subsidy it received. Camden's current mayor, Victor Karstafen, a former college basketball player and coach who grew up in the city himself and worked his way up through the city council before taking office, has leaned hard into that turnaround narrative since taking office in 2021, pointing in early 2025 to crime levels at 55, year lows, and touting new investments like a $100 million rebuild of East Side High School and federal infrastructure money for the city's port and its public green spaces. Not every voice in Camden shares his confidence. Local school board members and community advocates have pushed back publicly against city council votes to hand pieces of Camden's own municipal finances over to county oversight, arguing the city still has not been given the tools to stand fully on its own after decades of state intervention. Camden today counts just over 71,000 residents, a population that has essentially stabilized after 70 years of decline, though it remains, by most measures, either the poorest or second poorest city in the entire state of New Jersey, with a poverty rate still hovering near 30% and a median household income under $41,000 a year. Roughly 45% of employment in the city now comes from what local economists call eds and meds, education and medicine, anchored by Cooper University Hospital, Rutgers Camden, and Rowan University's Cooper Medical School, which opened in 2012 on a campus built partly on land once occupied by RCA's old manufacturing buildings, a fundamentally different economic base than the manufacturing engine that built the city a century ago. Critics of the tax incentive program point out that many of the companies that took the largest breaks employ only a small handful of actual Camden residents, raising the uncomfortable question of whether the new corporate towers on the waterfront have actually rebuilt Camden or simply been built inside it, extracting the tax advantages of a distressed zip code without meaningfully changing the lives of the people who live there. Camden's current municipal leadership, like the reformers who dissolved the police department a decade earlier, continues to describe the last 12 years as a genuine turnaround still very much in progress, pointing to falling crime, rising private investment, and a downtown skyline that, for the first time since the shipyard closed in 1967, actually has cranes in it building something new. Walk the Camden waterfront today, and both very different versions of the city sit within view of each other, close enough to see one from the other. The battleship USS New Jersey, permanently docked since 1999, looms over families visiting the Adventure Aquarium a short walk away. The Victor Building, the old RCA plant that once employed 12,000 workers and recorded some of the most famous voices of the 20th century, has been converted into market-rate apartments, its nipper-stained glass window preserved a few miles away in a museum rather than a factory. New office towers built with public incentives rise along the river, largely empty of the ordinary Camden residents whose tax-exempt city helped subsidize them into existence. A few blocks up Mickle Street, Walt Whitman's small brick row house still stands as a quiet museum, outlasting every industry that ever passed through the city around it. And a few blocks further inland, past the aquarium and the ballpark and the gleaming new headquarters, the same row house neighborhoods that once housed shipyard and cannery workers still carry the visible scars of 70 years of population loss, vacant lots where families once lived, storefronts that have never reopened since the last recession before this one. Camden was built by exactly the kind of industrial logic that made sense for half a century and then, all at once, stopped making sense at all. A single city that lived through the entire arc of American manufacturing, from scrappy 19th century workshop to global industrial powerhouse to hollowed-out cautionary tale, compressed into less than 100 years. Whether the city currently being built on its waterfront, financed by tax breaks instead of factories, and policed by a department built from scratch instead of reformed from within, ends up serving the people still living a few blocks away, is a question this city has been asking itself, in one form or another, for almost 60 years now, and one it still has not fully answered,